Have you noticed how difficult it has become for people to truly listen to one another? We live in a world where everybody is talking, arguing, posting, reacting, and defending their tribe, but very few people seem willing to slow down long enough to understand somebody else's experience. Fear, outrage, politics, religion, culture, social media, they've all combined to make empathy feel less like a strength and more like a liability. Welcome to Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be taking a look at 3 readings from the Christian Bible through the lens of sacred myth. As we reflect on the readings for Pentecost Sunday, we'll explore what empathy really requires of us, learning how to cross cultural divides, value human differences, and show up for people in moments of fear, pain, and vulnerability. In this episode, we're asking an uncomfortable but important question. What happens to families, communities, and entire societies when people stop seeing each other as human beings and start treating one another like enemies, outsiders, or obstacles to overcome? Because honestly, we're watching that happen all around us right now. So grab a comfy seat, a glass of your favorite beverage, and let's look at some ancient stories together in this edition of Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be exploring the readings for Pentecost Sunday, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. In this series, we're exploring readings from the Bible through the lens of sacred myth, looking for interpretations and lessons that don't require belief in the supernatural. These texts were written by pre-scientific people shaped by their own cultures, needs, and agendas, not as history books or scientific manuals, but as meaning-making stories for their communities. And just like believers approach these writings through the lens of faith, I approach them through a more humanistic lens, one that's grounded in the idea that certain foundational values helped humans evolve and flourish. Now, you might agree with the lessons I find, or you might find something completely different. That's the beauty of treating these writings as sacred myth. We're free to negotiate with the text and discover whatever insights we need right now. So with that, let's dive in. As I said, tonight we'll be looking at the readings for Pentecost Sunday, Cycle A. Our first reading is from Acts of the Apostles. It's chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Our second reading is from the first letter to the Corinthians. It's chapter 12, verses 3b through 7, and verses 12 and 13. And our gospel reading is from John. It's chapter 20, verses 19 through 23. Now we'll start by going through all 3 of the readings, then we'll look for the messages and the main lesson in each one. Finally, we'll bring everything together, look at what it means for us today, and talk about where we go from here. And with that, let's begin. Our first reading is from Acts of the Apostles. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues." Our second reading is from the first letter to the Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, no one can say, "Jesus is Lord," except by the Holy Spirit. There are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in everyone, it is the same God at work. Now to each one the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. Just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit, so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink. And our gospel reading is from John. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." All right, so let's go back and take a critical look at these readings and see what learnings and lessons we can find if we dig around just a little bit. So our first reading was from Acts of the Apostles. And the Pentecost story, it's one of the strangest and most dramatic scenes in the New Testament. A violent wind, tongues of fire, a crowd suddenly hearing people from different regions all speaking in their own languages. Now, whether we read this as literal history, symbolic storytelling, or a heavily mythologized memory of a powerful communal experience, the deeper human message underneath it is surprisingly relevant. The miracle isn't really the fire or the wind. The miracle is understanding. In a world divided by culture, language, identity, and tribe, people suddenly feel seen and heard instead of alienated from one another. That matters because human beings are naturally tribal creatures. We tend to trust people who talk like us, think like us, vote like us, worship like us, share our experiences. And when somebody speaks from a different culture or a different worldview, our instinct is, well, it's often to just dismiss them, to argue with them maybe, or force them to adapt to our way of seeing the world. But empathy asks something harder of us. It asks us to listen carefully, and listen carefully enough to understand what life feels like from the other side of the conversation. Not just to hear their words, but to hear the context, to hear fear, the history or struggle, the hope, the lived experience. Real empathy doesn't erase differences. It learns how to navigate those differences, but to do so with humility and curiosity. Now, in that sense, the Pentecost story, it becomes a powerful metaphor for what healthy communities actually require. We don't build stronger communities by demanding uniformity. We build them by learning how to communicate across differences without losing our shared humanity. And honestly, that feels almost supernatural sometimes. In a culture where people constantly talk past each other online or reduce one another to stereotypes or treat disagreements like moral contamination, the simple act of truly listening, well, that's gotten extremely rare. But empathy begins when we stop trying to win every conversation and start trying to understand the human being who's standing in front of us. Real empathy begins when we stop demanding that other people become more like us before we're willing to understand them. So the main lesson I got from our first reading is that we must meet people where they are and honor their story. Empathy is not about agreeing with everybody or pretending our differences don't matter. Empathy is about recognizing that every person carries experiences, fears, traditions, and struggles that shape how they see the world. If we want healthier families and communities, healthier societies, we have to become better translators for one another, not just linguistically, but emotionally and culturally too. We have to care enough to listen before we judge and understand before we react. We must meet people where they are and honor their story. Our second reading was from the first letter to the Corinthians. And one of the most interesting things about this passage from Corinthians is that, at least in theory, it kind of pushes back against the human tendency to rank people by status or visibility or power. The author uses the metaphor of a body made up of many different parts. He uses that metaphor to argue that every person has value and every role matters. Now, historically, religious institutions have not always lived up to that ideal. Churches have generally created rigid hierarchies. They've excluded outsiders. They've silenced marginalized voices. And they've really concentrated authority in the hands of a few, usually the hands of a few men. But underneath the theology and all the institutional baggage, there is still a humanistic insight here. And communities function best when people recognize their interdependence instead of obsessing over superiority. Empathy plays an important role in that because empathy helps us understand that other people contribute things that we can't. Some people are organizers, some are caregivers, some are protectors, some are teachers, artists, builders, problem solvers, or just plain old truth tellers. Healthy communities need all of those gifts. But modern culture often teaches us to value people based almost entirely on money, productivity, popularity, or influence. If somebody can't produce enough, entertain enough, or compete hard enough, well, they're treated as if they're disposable. That mindset, it slowly erodes empathy because it trains us to see human beings as like transactional economic units instead of seeing them as people with dignity and very unique value. The truth is that none of us survive alone. Every single person depends on networks of support that are often invisible to us. Farmers grow food we will never personally thank them for. Workers maintain infrastructure that we barely notice until it breaks. Teachers shape minds. Nurses care for strangers. Friends provide emotional support during difficult times. Even the people who challenge us or think differently than we do, they can strengthen communities by bringing perspectives that we might otherwise miss. Empathy helps us recognize that diversity is not just something to put up with. Diversity is one of the primary reasons human societies are able to adapt, evolve, and flourish. Empathy grows stronger when we recognize that human diversity is not a weakness to tolerate. Diversity is a strength, and it allows communities to thrive. So the main lesson I got from our second reading is that our differences make us stronger together. Empathy is bigger than kindness or compassion in isolated moments. It also shapes how we build systems or build communities and relationships. When we recognize the value and the dignity of different people with different strengths, we become less arrogant, less dismissive, and hopefully less fearful of human diversity. We stop asking, well, how can people become more like me? And we start asking, what does this person contribute that helps all of us grow? Strong communities aren't built through sameness. They're built through mutual respect, shared responsibility, and appreciation for our interconnected lives. Our differences make us stronger together. Okay, our final reading was from the Gospel of John. And this passage from John takes place in a locked room filled with anxious, frightened people. The disciples are hiding because they're terrified about what might happen next. And honestly, that part of the story feels pretty believable. Fear has a way of shrinking our world. When people experience grief, trauma, failure, rejection, or uncertainty, well, they often pull inward. They isolate themselves emotionally. They become defensive, suspicious. Sometimes they just become numb. And whether or not we take the supernatural elements of this story literally, the emotional reality underneath it, well, that's something almost everybody recognizes. Human beings need comfort, reassurance. We need connection during difficult moments. One of the most meaningful parts of empathy is the willingness to enter those locked rooms with other people. Not to fix everything, not to preach at them, not to explain away their pain with worn-out cliches or some shallow positivity. We need to enter those proverbial locked rooms just to be present, to create enough emotional safety that another person can breathe again. Modern culture is very often terrible at this. We are uncomfortable with vulnerability. Or we feel awkward around someone else's grief. Or we get impatient with mental health struggles. We're conditioned to avoid emotional discomfort whenever possible. But empathy requires courage because it asks us to remain emotionally available even when somebody else's pain makes us incredibly uncomfortable. The story also contains themes of reconciliation and healing. In many religious traditions, forgiveness is framed almost entirely as a spiritual transaction between humans and God. But from a humanistic perspective, forgiveness and reconciliation, well, they're often about releasing cycles of harm that poison relationships and communities. Now, it does not mean ignoring abuse or tolerating injustice or pretending accountability doesn't matter. And sometimes the healthiest thing a person can do is to establish strong boundaries or maybe even walk away entirely. But empathy reminds us that wounded people frequently wound other people. And healing communities require spaces where honesty, accountability, compassion, and emotional repair can all coexist. Empathy often begins with the simple decision to show up for people who are hurting instead of leaving them isolated in their fear. So the main lesson I got from our gospel reading is that we must show up for people when they are hurting. Empathy is not always dramatic. Sometimes it looks incredibly ordinary. Sitting beside someone who's grieving. Listening without interrupting. You're checking on a friend who's struggling with something. Creating an environment where people feel safe enough to speak honestly about fear, anxiety, shame, or the pain they're feeling. In a world that often rewards performance, or emotional detachment, and constant competition, simply being present for another human being, that can become a radical act of care. And those small moments of connection, well, those are often what help people begin to heal. We must show up for people when they're hurting. All right, let's review the lessons we've talked about so far. In our first reading from Acts of the Apostles, the main lesson I came away with was we must meet people where they are and honor their story. In our second reading from 1 Corinthians, the main lesson I got was our differences make us stronger together. And finally, the main lesson I got from our gospel reading was we must show up for people when they are hurting. Empathy is so much bigger than simply being nice to people. Empathy is the difficult, uncomfortable, deeply human work of trying to understand people whose lives and experiences are different from our own. It means learning how to communicate across cultures, ideologies, and personal histories, instead of just retreating into tribes that only seem to reinforce what we already believe. It means recognizing that human diversity is not a threat to overcome. It's one of the greatest strengths any healthy community can possess. And empathy means being willing to sit with people in moments of fear, grief, confusion, or pain, instead of abandoning them when life gets messy. Real empathy is active. Real empathy listens carefully, values different perspectives, creates emotional safety, and it helps repair the fractures that keep so many communities divided. And in a world that profits from outrage, isolation, and dehumanization, choosing to understand and care for one another may be one of the most revolutionary things we can do. So let's step back and take another look at these readings overall and see if we can figure out what these lessons really mean to us in our daily lives. To do this, I'll try to answer two questions. So what? And now what? Okay, so what? Why should we care about any of this? Well, we should care because empathy directly challenges the toxic tribalism that's just tearing our society apart. Far too many people, especially religious leaders and political movements, use culture, nationality, race, religion. They use these as weapons to divide people into us and them. But the Pentecost story points in the exact opposite direction. It presents understanding across languages and cultures as something sacred and life-giving. If your worldview only makes room for people who look like you, think like you, worship like you, or vote like you, then empathy has already collapsed. These lessons are important because hyper-individualism is slowly destroying our sense of community. Modern culture constantly tells us to focus on ourselves, build our brand, build your personal brand, protect your own success, treat dependence like some sort of weakness. But the reality is that human beings are deeply interconnected, whether we want to admit it or not. Nobody succeeds alone. Nobody survives alone. And when people stop caring about one another, societies become colder, crueler, and more unstable. Empathy reminds us that other people, they're not obstacles or competitors or disposable background characters in our personal story. They are people with value. We should care because empathy may be one of the few things capable of slowing this cycle of political hatred and social dehumanization that's going on right now. I mean, right now, outrage is profitable. Algorithms, they reward anger. Entire media ecosystems are designed to keep people afraid of one another. And when fear takes over, people stop seeing opponents as human beings, and they start seeing them as enemies to destroy. But peace is rarely built through humiliation or retaliation. Peace begins when somebody is willing to step into tense, fearful spaces and lower the emotional temperature long enough for actual understanding to happen. This is important because loneliness, isolation, anxiety, and emotional exhaustion, they're everywhere right now. People are desperate to feel seen, heard, valued, understood. Empathy is not some soft, sentimental luxury. Empathy is part of the social glue that allows human beings to survive difficult times together. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply notice another person's pain and refuse to let them carry it alone. If we want stronger communities, healthier relationships, and a less hostile world, then empathy can't remain some vague feeling we talk about from time to time. Empathy has to become a daily practice we intentionally live out. The last question I try to answer is, now what? What are we supposed to do? Where do we go from here? Well, one of the hardest things about empathy is that it often asks us to move toward discomfort instead of away from it. Most of us like to think of ourselves as open-minded and maybe compassionate people, but the truth is that fear, frustration, pride, even exhaustion can cause us to shut down before we truly hear another person out. Sometimes we avoid difficult conversations because we assume we already know what the other person believes. Sometimes we keep our distance because crossing social, political, cultural, or emotional divides simply, it just feels risky or awkward. But if we never move beyond those barriers, our world slowly becomes smaller and smaller and more isolated. So with that in mind, here's your question for the week. When have I stopped listening because of fear, frustration, or discomfort? And what small step could I take this week to better understand someone else's perspective? This question matters because personal growth rarely happens inside of our emotional comfort zones. Learning how to listen better can strengthen friendships, improve family relationships. It can reduce unnecessary conflict. Listening better can help us become calmer and more emotionally mature people. It can also help us challenge our own assumptions and maybe recognize blind spots we may not even realize we have. And importantly, understanding somebody, it's not the same thing as agreeing with them. You can strongly disagree with another person while still recognizing their humanity and still trying to understand how their experiences shaped their worldview. When I was 26 years old, I worked as a supervisor at GM's North Star engine assembly plant. One of the people working under me was a team leader named Joe. And Joe had been at GM since before I was born. He was older than my father, he was highly experienced, and he was very much a union man. And me, I was management, which in his mind probably placed me somewhere between annoyance and enemy. Joe was gruff, he was distant, clearly unimpressed with this young supervisor who had just shown up on the factory floor one day acting like he belonged there. Honestly, at first, it would have been easy for both of us to stay on either side of that union versus management divide. And I could have treated him like a difficult employee. He could have treated me like another clueless manager who wouldn't last. But I realized pretty quickly that if I actually wanted to succeed in that environment, I needed to understand the people I was working with, especially Joe, my team leader. So over several weeks, I started making a point of talking with him regularly. And not just about work orders or problems on the floor, but about ordinary life. And instead of interrogating him, peppering him with a shitload of personal questions, I would casually share little things about my own life too. Slowly, the walls started coming down. And then one day, Joe asked if he could talk with me privately. Now, I had mentioned some of the volunteer work I did with teens and young adults, and it turned out Joe was dealing with a painful situation involving his daughter. Her husband was abusive, and Joe felt completely overwhelmed. This tough, highly skilled team leader, the guy who knew everything about that factory and could solve almost any workplace problem, he was emotionally devastated and didn't know what to do. As it happened, despite my young age at the time, I actually had some experience helping young people dealing with abuse. So I at least knew where to start. And we had several long conversations, and I was eventually able to connect him and his daughter with professionals who could really help. That experience changed the way I viewed people, especially people I initially saw as difficult, closed off, or opposed to me. Underneath Joe's rough exterior was a deeply caring father who was scared for his daughter. And while Joe and I still didn't agree on everything after that, we trusted each other a lot more, and we worked together far better than before. None of that would have happened if we had stayed trapped inside the union versus management labels that we had assigned to each other. It only happened because one of us decided to cross the divide long enough to see the human being on the other side. For me, it was one of the earliest and probably the most important lessons I ever learned about empathy. The goal this week is not to solve every conflict in your life or become best friends with everybody you disagree with. The goal is simply to practice crossing one small divide instead of reinforcing that divide. So spend some time with our question this week. When have I stopped listening because of fear, frustration, or discomfort? And what small step could I take this week to better understand someone else's perspective? Maybe that means asking more questions instead of immediately debating someone. Maybe it means listening without interrupting. Maybe it means reconnecting with someone you've emotionally pulled away from. Small acts of empathy may seem insignificant in the moment, but over time, they can reshape relationships, reshape communities, and even reshape the way we understand ourselves. Well, before I wrap things up, I'd like to leave you with one more thought. When addressing this concept of empathy, American psychologist Carl Rogers once wrote, "To be with another in this way means that, for the time being, you lay aside your own views and values in order to enter another's world without prejudice." That's a difficult idea. And honestly, it can sound almost impossible in today's world. Most of us are constantly evaluating, defending, reacting, debating, and filtering everything through our own assumptions and experiences. We often listen just long enough to prepare our rebuttal. But Rogers is describing something much deeper than simple politeness. He's talking about the willingness to temporarily loosen our grip on our own ego long enough to genuinely understand another human being from the inside instead of simply stepping back and judging them from the outside. And perhaps even more importantly, that does not mean abandoning your values, surrendering your boundaries, or pretending harmful behavior is acceptable somehow. It simply means that understanding another person requires curiosity before any sort of judgment. It requires enough humility to admit that your own perspective is incomplete. That is the real challenge behind this week's question. When fear, frustration, ideology, or discomfort stop us from listening, we cut ourselves off from opportunities to grow, connect, and better understand the people around us. To be with another in this way means that, for the time being, you lay aside your own views and values in order to enter another's world without prejudice. Real empathy, it's not a weakness. It's emotional discipline. It is the courage to remain human in situations where it would be far easier to become cynical, stay tribal, or just be dismissive. And in a divided, angry, and isolated culture, people who can truly listen without immediately dehumanizing others may become some of the most important bridge builders our communities have left. All right, we've come to the end of this episode. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again next week, but in the meantime, I encourage you to engage with our question for the week and pay attention to the important lessons you come across, wherever you find them. You'll create a more purposeful and joyful life, and you'll start to feel more connected to the world and the people around you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mythologizing the Bible, as we did a deeper dive into the readings for Pentecost Sunday, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. Remember that choosing to understand and care for one another, choosing empathy, may be one of the most revolutionary things we can do. The Bible readings used for this episode are from the Holy Bible New International Version, NIV. Copyright 1973, 1978, 1984, 2011 by Biblica Inc. Used by permission, all rights reserved worldwide. Thanks again for listening. If you like this content, please consider telling a friend about it. The more people who hear the positive messages I'm sharing, the better. Mythologizing the Bible is a live-streamed series held most Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on twitch.tv/thecodaproject. Every week, the audio of these Mythologizing the Bible presentations is released as a podcast. You can find the podcast at thecodaproject.com or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Pocket Casts. To learn more, to subscribe to my mailing list, and to keep up on everything I'm doing with the Coda Project, please visit thecodaproject.com.